Living Power with Dan Hurd.
Compassion, the fourth thing is compassion is about present and future needs. It's not just about needs, a need that somebody has right now, but it's also about future needs. Look at Matthew 15, verse 32. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd. This is when he was feeding the poor, when he met with the 5,000, remember? I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I'm unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way. Jesus was looking at the future needs, the current condition, but looking at the future need. Compassion sees a current need, but it also looks at the future. This person needs compassion because of the future issues, the future needs that they're going to have in their life. And then, compassion puts one's needs above another. Compassion puts one's needs above another. There's this beautiful story in the Bible about Ruth. We just looked at a verse in chapter 1 just a few minutes ago. But Naomi, her mother-in-law, was trying to get Ruth, who is now a widow, to go back to her family, go back to her homeland. And Ruth refuses, and she says in chapter 1, verse 18, she's just told her mother, you know, look, I'm going to go with you. Wherever you go, I will follow you. I will stay with you to the ends of the earth. And then verse 18, look what it says. When she, Naomi, saw that she, Ruth, was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Isn't that just like a mother-in-law? Well, but that's not what it says. That's really not what it means. Let me give you a little insight into this verse. This verse doesn't mean that Naomi stopped talking to Ruth because she was mad at her, or because she just couldn't get through to her. It means that when Naomi saw how determined Ruth was, that she stopped trying to persuade her. Ruth was determined that she was going to go with Naomi, and no amount of talking was going to stop her from doing that. No matter how uncomfortable the journey was going to be, it didn't matter whether there was going to be food or not to eat. Ruth was determined to stick with Naomi because they both needed each other. And that is the picture of compassion. She put her mother-in-law's needs above her. She wasn't even her mother-in-law anymore. Because, I mean, her husband had died. She was now a widow. So she wasn't really even her mother-in-law anymore. But she put her needs above hers. She said, you're worth this. You're worth me investing my life in. I want to give myself to you and help you through your needs. Compassion sees the other person's needs and puts those needs above your own. In fact, 1 Corinthians 13:7 says it this way. Love, it's defining love in the 13, it's the love chapter of Corinthians. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Listen, the only way that we can minister in people's lives, the only way that we can touch people's lives who are really hurting and struggling, and people's lives who are really damaged, the only way that we can make a difference in their lives is when we are motivated by love. And what is love? Allowing God to do something in someone else's life through you. That's the definition of love. Allowing God to do something in someone else's life through you. If you're going to love somebody, it's not that you're going to be all lovey-dovey and huggy, you know, and just pat them on the popo and tell them what nice people they are, you know, and then, oh, you're just the best person, and, you know, that's not love. You know, that's silly. Love is allowing God to do something in someone else's life through you. It's the only way your marriage can survive. It's the only way your marriage can survive if you're willing to let God do something in your spouse's life through you. It's the only way your marriage will survive. It's the only way your family can survive. If you allow God to do something in your children's life through you, you will succeed as a parent. It's the only way that you can put your family back together. If you're willing to let God do something in their life through you, you will see God work a miracle. Because that is love, allowing God to do something in someone else's life through you. And love bears all things, and believes all things, and hopes all things. Hope being that confident anticipation that something's going to happen. A confident anticipation that God is going to do something. And love endures all things. And then, compassion is a lifestyle. Compassion becomes a way of life for you. You know the story of the Good Samaritan? The man was walking on the road, and he was in this part of Samaria that was very dangerous, and there were lots of thieves that would hang out in the rocks. And there was an area that was also called the Valley of the Shadow of Death, from Psalm 23. Because in that area, in the evening, it would cast these long shadows, and the thieves would hide in this area. They would, if you were caught there in the evening, you were likely to be robbed, maybe even murdered. It was a very dangerous area. And this guy got robbed while he was walking through that area. And here came a priest along the line, saw him and just walked around to the other side of the road. But didn't want anything to do with him. Could be a setup. Got to be careful. Here come another one. Yeah, it's not worth it. Here came a Samaritan. They were considered kind of the bums, the scum of the earth. They were the derelicts. They were the people that you didn't really want to associate with. They were the outcasts of society, the Samaritans. They were you didn't want your daughter dating a Samaritan. Along came a Samaritan and gave himself to him, helped him, took him to a home and had him healed, had his wounds bound. In fact, Luke 10:33 says, the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Compassion is a lifestyle. It's just something that you do because you know it's something you have to do. It's a lifestyle. You do it because it's your way of life. It's not something, even though it's a choice, and compassion is a choice, it is a choice that you make on a regular basis. And so when the time comes, you don't have to go, well, should I or shouldn't I be compassionate? Become compassionate because it's a lifestyle. There's a guy by the name of Curtis who was a stock boy. He was working one day, and this voice came over the overhead in the intercom. It was a new voice that he hadn't heard before, and the voice said, need to carry out at register 4. So he was almost finished, and so he wanted to get some fresh air and take a little break, so he went to answer the call, and then he saw who the new voice was, and he thought, wow, she's hot, she was pretty. He wanted to know who this new checkout girl was. So later that day, after shift was over, he waited by the punch clock, in the employee room. He waited by the punch clock to find out her name, and when she came through, she saw him, she smiled, and she took her ticket, she punched it, and she walked out. And he walked over, and he took her ticket. Brenda, her name is Brenda. So he goes out of the employee room, follows her, to maybe try to talk with her, and he sees her walking up the road. She's gone. So the next day, he gets up just a little early, and he punches out, and he's outside the supermarket waiting for her in his car. And he offers her a ride. And she smiles, and she thinks, well, he looks harmless enough, and she says, okay. And when he dropped her off, he said, could I maybe see you again, sometime, out of work? And she said, no, that wouldn't work. And he pressed her to explain. And she said, well, she had a couple of children, and she couldn't afford a babysitter. He said, well, how about I pay for the babysitter? He was just persistent. He wasn't going to give up. And finally, she accepted his offer for a date. And that Saturday night, he came to her door, and she met him at the door, and she said, I have bad news. The babysitter called and canceled. To which he replied, well, let's take the kids with us. And she said, well, no, that's really not an option. That can't happen. That's just not going to work. And he kept pressing for this explanation, and finally she just was exasperated. She says, come in. He came in, and she introduced him to her older daughter, who he thought was just as cute as a button, just a darling little girl. And then she went out for a second, and she came back in, and she brought in her son in a wheelchair, who was born a paraplegic with Down syndrome. And Curtis looked at him, he said, hi, how are you? And he talked with him, just for a few moments. And then he looked at Brenda, and he said, look, I don't understand, why can't the kids go with us? And she was stunned. I mean, most men would run away from a woman with 2 kids, much less one who's disabled, just like her husband and the father of her children had done. Well, she didn't have an answer for him. So that evening, they loaded up the kids, and they went to dinner, and they went to the movies, and when her son needed anything, Curtis would take care of him. When he needed to go to the restroom, he'd pick him up out of the chair, take him to the restroom, and then he would bring him back. And he was just that way all evening long. And the kids fell in love with him. And so did Brenda. And so a year later, believe it or not, they got married. And Curtis adopted both of her children. So what happened to that stock boy and that checkout girl? Well, Mr. and Mrs. Kurt Warner eventually moved to St. Louis, where he became the quarterback of the St. Louis Rams. And he was twice elected most valuable player of the National Football League, and he led his team to the Super Bowl, where he was also named the MVP of the game, and then later he quarterbacked the Arizona Cardinals to the Super Bowl. But the most powerful thing that Kurt Warner ever said or did was this, when he said, "Whether I'm a Super Bowl champion or a regular guy stocking groceries at the Hy-Vee, sharing my faith and glorifying Jesus is the central focus of my time on earth." Compassion is a lifestyle that's born out of a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not fate. It's not something that you make up. It's not something you pretend to be. It's something that happens because Christ lives inside of you. And you have a focus and a desire to make a difference in somebody's life who's ready for Christ to make a difference in their life. Not just because they are hurting and you want to help them, but because you really want them to come to know Christ and see the joy that you've discovered. And so the final point is compassion is shared with those who don't deserve it, but desire it. You know the story of the prodigal son. The son left his father and his brother and left his family because he just decided, all right, I've had it. I'm leaving this pop stand and I'm headed into the bright lights of city world. And he goes and he leaves home, and sure enough, he loses everything. And he's a Jew, and he ends up taking care of pigs. And that had to be really a mess. And finally he says, I had it better at home. I should just go back as a slave. And he comes back home, decides that he's not worth anything. He doesn't have anything, and he isn't going to get anything because he had received his inheritance from his father. Remember? That's what he took and lived on for so long. But he needed to come back. He knew he needed to come back. And he comes back, and he has this speech already, and I'm just going to tell my dad, look, I'm not worthy, and I'm willing to be a slave if you'll just let me come back. And Luke chapter 15, verse 20 says, he got up and he went to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him. Listen, this is a story that is a picture of God's love for you. You don't deserve what God has for you. You don't deserve compassion. But God, in His desire for you, because He sees you as an individual that is worth dying for on the cross, He was willing to invest His life in you because He can't stand the idea of spending the rest of eternity without you. And so He's willing to invest Himself in your life. That same God who had compassion on you has compassion on the people in your world also. And He wants to express that compassion through you. You're His minister in that world. You're the expression of His compassion in that world. If they don't see that compassion through you, where are they going to learn it? Where are they going to see it? How are they going to discover it? If God has put you in that circle of influence at this point, at this place in time in history, there's obviously a reason for it. And if you don't do it, then how's it going to happen? That's what God did for you. Proverbs 18:24 says, there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Who's that friend? Of course, it's Christ. He'll stick with you through those tough times. He'll accept you as you are. He'll reach beyond His comfort zone for you, so much so that He would die on the cross for you. He'll offer you words of comfort and hope. He'll meet your needs. But only when you're ready. And He expects you to be the same way with others, to minister in the same way with other people. He is that beautiful picture of compassion, but He paints it through your life. Jesus' ministry was centered on helping hurting, needy people. And when He saw people, He was quick to discern their hurts and their helplessness and their needs. And He's given us the example, and we are to follow the steps of Jesus to be compassionate. But we're to be wise in how we show that compassion. I love what the instructions are to Titus, in Titus chapter 3, verse 14, about us. These are instructions for us, and I close with this verse. And let our people learn to devote themselves to good works, so as to help cases of urgent need, and not be unfruitful. What a calling. What a calling on your life, to be the picture of Jesus in somebody's world.